When you're elected to the House of Commons, even if you're elected on a Republican ticket, you're not able to take your seat until you've sworn an oath of allegiance, not just to the King, the monarch of the day, but to his heirs and successors. Anyone taking an oath of allegiance to the King, immediately after the July the 4th election, will take an oath of allegiance to people like Prince Andrew as well, he being part of the heirs and successors of Charles. That's an outrageous situation for this country to call it a democracy when you cannot take your seat until you've taken an oath to an unelected person. If you don't take your oath, you can't take your seat. If you take your seat without taking an oath, you can be barred and fined. So there is a restriction, not just on individuals, but on political parties, because if a political party stands for election on a manifesto commitment to abolish the monarchy, and if that party were to secure a majority of seats in the House of Commons, they would have to take an oath of allegiance to the monarch before they decided to abolish him. That's clearly a ludicrous situation. The only change that we made to the oath in 150, 200 years has been to remove the need to swear allegiance via God. The oath is prescribed. It's a particular form of words. You're not allowed to vary it. When I took the oath, I gave my own oath first, which was to uphold democracy and serve my constituents. And then I mumbled as incoherently as possible the official oath which I was given. When Hansard appeared the next day, my oath was missing and the official oath was accorded in Hansard. So even the systems in Parliament conspire to prevent members of Parliament expressing views on the monarchy in that way. And of course, it's almost impossible for members of Parliament to raise matters to do with the monarchy on the floor of the Commons. It's an interesting fact that people are unaware of. There is something called King's Consent. The idea of that is that both the King and, in this case, Prince William, will have access to prospective legislation before it's published, before members of Parliament have an opportunity to look at it even, and for them in the royal family to give their views on it. And this is not legislation which relates to the generality of what Parliament does. It's legislation that may affect their private, so-called private possessions, their private lands, their private estates. Why, you might ask, should an individual family have access to legislation before Parliament and be able to amend it to benefit themselves privately? But that's what the King's Consent and Prince's Consent allow to occur, and they are used. Of course, what happens is there's a phone call from the Cabinet Office to the Palace or to the representatives of the Palace, and discussions take place orally, and any changes are made in that way. So that when the official submission is sent to the King or the Prince of Wales, no changes need to be made because they've been made already orally, which gives the royal family the excuse of saying nothing has changed. That's dishonest as well as corrupt. This takes various forms. I remember sitting on the Animal Welfare Bill Committee in 2006. RSPCA was to be given rights to enter private land in order to check if they believed there was a possibility of animal welfare offences being committed, except that under pressure from the palace, Sandringham and Balmoral and other royal lands were excluded from that provision. Now, I don't suggest that the royal family is going around torturing animals, but why were they exempt? Under what basis could that be right to exempt them? There's been all sorts of exemptions over the years. Charles was exempted from the Nuclear Explosions Act, presumably to allow him to carry out his experiment with his chemistry set somewhere. This is a ludicrous arrangement in 21st century Britain and should be abolished. The Commons could change it within 5 minutes on the floor of the chamber, but they've chosen not to do so. Of course, the public has a right to know what's going on in a democracy. This should happen through parliamentary questions, parliamentary probing from MPs and peers. It does, by and large, because it's almost impossible for MPs to raise questions about the royal family on the floor of the Commons. During my 18 years in Parliament, I was the only member of Parliament to instigate a debate on the royal family. And I had to do that. The only way I could do it was by linking it back to the obscure 1993 Treasury document. That was the only way I was allowed to do so. So if Parliament is not holding the royal family to account for what it does, can the public at large? The answer is it doesn't, because the Freedom of Information Act, which was brought in 2000 and took effect in 2005, has been narrowed to exclude the ability of the public to hold the royal family to account. In other respects, the Freedom of Information Act has been widened. For example, bodies like Network Rail have been brought into it. But after Charles's so-called spider letters were published in The Guardian, which showed him quite improperly applying political pressure to ministers of the day to get his political views mainstream, for example, to support homeopathy or to stop the ban on hunting with dogs. Once that became public, the response from Charles was not to say, oh, I shouldn't have done this. No, what he said to the government was, let's tighten the Freedom of Information Act so now there's an absolute exemption on information being released about the King and the Prince of Wales, even if it's in the public interest for us to know. It's interesting that even when the royal family is at the height of popularity, a good 20% of the population, at least, will be Republican. When the royal family is unpopular, that can reach 45, 50%. So you expect, would you not, in a House of Commons of 650 MPs, for at least a fifth of those MPs to be Republican in nature? And I believe that in the last Parliament and the Parliament before that and the one before that, there were 100 such MPs who were Republican in nature. But they were secret Republicans. They don't want to say so because they're frightened that it will lose them votes to do that. So when I was in Parliament, I would have lots of MPs who would tell me they agree with me when I was bringing forward matters to do with the royal family as best I could, but they wouldn't do so themselves. The number of MPs who were overtly Republican was no more than 10 in any Parliament I've ever been into. And that's a microcosm of what MPs actually feel. One indication, perhaps, is that when there was a vote to look at the oath back in about 2002, 2003, it was massively supported by Labour MPs and the Dem MPs and SNP MPs, not by Conservatives. So there's an indication that there's a latent republicanism, I think, in parties to the centre and the left in this country, either directly for a republic or at the very least for a more modern monarchy. We're living in Britain in 2024. We're not living in Britain in 1758. The idea of an imperial monarchy, which behaves as if nothing has changed in 300, 400 years, is frankly ludicrous. It holds the country back. Those who say it's an asset for the country fail to understand that what it does is it pretends the country and tells the country falsely that Britain has not moved on. There was still a world power, that we could still sit down as Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin did in 1945. Britain has changed, and the royal family doesn't recognise that. It wants things to be kept in aspect. It therefore holds back Britain's progress of becoming a truly modern democratic country, as we ought to be in this day and age.